Let's take a look at the implementation of the user interface for this little single page app. Switch over here to my editor and show you the basic structure of the code. You can see here at the top level there's a package.json file, which we looked at a little bit in the last video. I've got a readme stuck out here, and then the business end of the application is actually stored in some other directories here. First of all, there's a public directory, and it's got an index file in it, which is actually going to be the main HTML file that the application is going to load, and then all of the other functionality is going to be pulled in by the browser from there. There's a Taylor favicon file that's going to be loaded by that index, and then all of the JavaScript behind this is going to be located in this source directory, and we're going to explore the contents of this directory in some detail. I've also got a models directory here where I've brought out the account objection model that we looked at in the server-side video. So we're not going to really go back and revisit that directory or its contents. Let's just take a look at the main HTML file. This is pretty typical HTML. It does some meta things, sets up our viewport, brings in our favicon file, and then it's going to load a couple of additional style sheets here with ordinary link tags. So we're grabbing the Roboto font from Google's font site. And then we're going to also bring in some icons from the material design icon library, and those are going to be used in our application. You notice that the body of this HTML is almost completely empty. We've got a no script tag, which isn't something you see very often, but this basically is code that's going to be executed if JavaScript is disabled by the user in their browser. And since this is a JavaScript-based app, there's not much we can do if that's the case, so we just kind of print a message to the display and give up. The final thing in this HTML is this div tag here near the end. You notice that it doesn't really seem to have much content. All it has is a paragraph that says loading, and then it has an ID property with a value of app. And you'll remember that in HTML, when you have an ID, it's supposed to be a unique identifier on this whole page, which is the case here. And that's going to become important because we're going to see that when the application itself loads into the browser, it's going to sort of insinuate itself into the page at this location. So all we're doing right now is just providing a basic template that's going to be a container for the JavaScript and other components that are going to make up our single page app. Now let's take a look at what is actually being loaded by the browser here. So I'm going to open up the view source window in my browser, and you can see that we've got pretty much the same HTML that we had back over in the editor, but there's a couple of new pieces that have been added to this version of the HTML page. Now, keep in mind that what we're doing here is running in the development mode that we explored earlier. That means that there's the Vue CLI service that's running in the background, it's keeping an eye on my source files, and it's automatically packaging those up and serving them to my browser. So when I access the URL for my test version of the application, I'm connecting to that web server, and the first thing that it's going to do is send me this HTML page, but it will also, behind the scenes, have added some additional markup that will tell my browser, go ahead and fetch the JavaScript and other files that make up the application in addition to just this static HTML page that we were looking at in the editor. And you can see that that's happening here, for example, in this link tag, which says load in something from /js/app.js. Well, what is that? That's not code that I created. That's just the Vue CLI service's way of giving the browser access to the bundled version of this code. In fact, we can click through this, and the browser is going to go out and request that particular JavaScript from the Vue CLI service that's running in the background. And you can see that there's a ton of code in here that's based on my application as well as the libraries and so forth that I'm bringing in from Vue and Vuetify. So behind the scenes, the Vue CLI service has added this markup to tell the browser, go ahead and bring in that additional code. And it's going to, as always with a link tag, it's going to just send another HTTP request to that Vue CLI service to fish this JavaScript down. So let's see how the Vue application actually gets started when we load it into the browser by using these inserted link tags. That's going to be in main.js. It's a very short file. You can see that it's going to import some things like Vue itself and the Vuetify CSS libraries. But the function call that's really critical in here is this constructor invocation of the Vue class itself. So we're making a new instance of the Vue class. And we're going to pass it a variety of different parameters that we're going to explore as we go. But the most important is this one right here, L, which stands for HTML element. And the value of that is going to be a CSS selector that refers to that div that we just got done looking at in the HTML file. You can see it's sharp app, and the CSS selector syntax defines the sharp to indicate an ID property with a particular value. So this says, look for the element whose ID property is app. And as you recall, back in the index page or the main HTML page, we've got an ID of app on this div. So that's how the underlying JavaScript code in Vue connects itself to the web page. We're saying insert yourself at this location, so kind of replacing this div with all of the goodness that's coming out of Vue and Vuetify. And that's what makes up our single page application. Switching back to our main.js file, let's look at another property of this Vue configuration. That's the render property, and as you can see, it takes as a value a function that's a fat arrow function. The parameter that's passed in is kind of a rendering object that's defined inside of Vue that we're not going to really take a look at in detail. But the key idea here is that it's going to be called with the component that forms kind of the top level of our application. And by convention, that's usually called app, as you see here. You can see that I've brought app in from this file called app.vue. Now, when we're dealing with Vue, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about components. A component is really just kind of a visual thing that does some task or provides some interface inside the application. And we'll see that Vue allows us to create components and nest them inside other components and reuse them in a whole variety of interesting ways. Components really have three pieces, and it makes sense if you think about it in the context, again, of a user interface. The first thing we're going to see in a component is the markup that's going to be eventually displayed in the browser. The second element is going to be some functionality in the form of JavaScript that's going to bring that component to life. And the third would be styling information, CSS essentially, that might modify the contents and the presentation of that component. Now, it'd certainly be possible for us to specify those three different things in three separate files. I could have a .html file of some kind to show the template, I could have a .js file to show the JavaScript, and I could have a .css file to show the styling information. It turns out, however, that those three things are tightly bound together in an implementation. So rather than separating them into three separate files, Vue introduces this new idea of a single file component. And that's what this app.vue file is. And you can see inside of here that there's two major sections. There's this template section that includes something that looks a whole lot like HTML markup. We've got a script section that looks a whole lot like JavaScript, and we could also, in this same file, have a style section that could contain CSS. So you can see that we're bringing together those three elements of every component in a single file. In this one, we don't have any CSS, and what we'll see here is that that's pretty common when we're using a library like Vuetify, because it provides global styling for our whole application. So once in a while, you'll override it by including an additional section in here called style, but most of the time, we'll just be seeing template and script. This isn't something that can be directly executed in your browser, because we're sort of crossing the streams here. We've got markup and we've got functionality. So one of the things that Vue does when you're running that Vue CLI service, or when you compile your application down for production deployment, is it extracts the pieces and parts from inside these .vue files and turns them into ordinary HTML and ordinary JavaScript and connects it up in such a way that it can execute in an ordinary browser. Let's take a little bit closer look at this app component. We can see here at the bottom that the principal return value from this component is going to be an object that defines the component. So it's a configuration that says here's what this object is and how it's supposed to behave. We're going to give it a name that can be used elsewhere in our application, and we're going to tell it that we want to use some components within this object from elsewhere. And we're going to use in particular the navbar component. So if we turn our attention to the template, again, these are not ordinary HTML elements. These are user-defined elements that are mostly coming out of the Vuetify library. They might also come out of Vue itself, and in some cases, they're components that we've defined to use in this application. You can see that the top level component is called v.app, and this is really a container that is defined by Vuetify to contain all of the markup within your application. Again, it's a single page application, and so we're defining that single page, and then we'll see that there's a mechanism that allows us to switch from view to view within that same page of the browser. You can see that this kind of consists of three components. There's this nav bar, we'll come back to that in a second. There's v-content, which is really the main portion of the page, and then there's v-footer. And those are the three elements that are part of the top-level v-app. And if we switch back to the application, we can see we've got the nav bar here at the top. The bulk of the page is reflected in that v-content, and then at the bottom we've got the footer. That's the third element that's defined inside the app component itself. What we're doing here is we're wrapping up the elements that we want to have recur on every view in the application with a nav bar and a footer at the bottom. And then the v-content is going to actually be replaced as we navigate from page to page with whatever's supposed to be part of that view of the application. Now, I mentioned the nav bar. We can see here that we're importing nav bar from navbar.view. You can see here in the directory structure, I've got a components subdirectory, and I use that for kind of small reusable components like the navigation bar, and here's where its source is. And then I've got a second directory called pages here, and this is really the information that's going to end up appearing in the main content portion of each of the views. When I import that navbar component, and that gives me access to this navbar element. You notice that although the class is named appropriately to JavaScript conventions with camel-cased characters, the component itself is available to me in kebab case. So it takes the declaration of this class and converts it from capital N, capital B into lowercase n, lowercase b, and separates words with a dash so that it looks like markup. Let's take a closer look at the navbar itself. Again, we've got the same basic structure with the top portion of the view single file component inside of template tags and the script inside of script tags. The top level element inside this template is v.app.bar, and that's actually a component that comes with Vuetify that's intended to implement these kinds of application bars at the top of apps. And it takes a few properties that mark it out as a particular color and using a dark color scheme instead of a light one. Then inside of this, we've got a whole variety of different functionality. Keep in mind that what we're trying to implement is, first of all, a title for our application that's also a link to the main page, some buttons that are going to allow our user to sign up or sign in or just get an About Us page. And then if the user is signed in, we want to be able to display that drop-down menu that shows the name and then some other options for logged in users only. So the first portion of the navbar is this section that provides us a link to our main page. And we're going to come back and talk about how this router link element works later. We've got a spacer. So you can see here that we've got space between the title and the first of the buttons. That's what's created by this V spacer. It creates a horizontal space that separates components inside the navbar. And then we've got some buttons. So V button is Vuetify's version of the HTML button. And we've got a button for sign up and a button for sign in. Now notice that there's some other weird looking markup going on in here. We've got this property called vIf. And vIf is a view property. When Vue looks at this markup and it's in the process of converting it into something that will run in your browser, it's going to look at the expression defined here as the value of the vIf property. And what vIf means is if this expression evaluates to true, then show this component. And if it doesn't evaluate to true, then hide this component. So based on the state of the application, in particular whether or not the user is logged in, this sign up button will either appear or not. So where is the isLoggedIn defined? Well, it's some JavaScript, so as you might expect, it's going to be defined in the script section of our single file component. If we scooch down here to the script, we can see that there's a function called isLoggedIn, and what it does is it returns some state information from inside the application itself. And we'll talk about how this works later on. But suffice it to say that this isLoggedIn property is going to be set to true if the user's logged in successfully, and it's going to be set to false if the user hasn't logged in successfully. And it's going to be used in this function, isLoggedIn, which is then evaluated when this button is being rendered. So the vIf says if is logged in is false, show this button. And if is logged in is true, because the user has logged in, then hide this button. If we go and sign in, you'll notice that as we log in, the buttons here are going to disappear and there's going to be some new stuff added. So hit login. At the point where I typed login, remember that on the server side we would have verified a password and sent some information back to the client to say, yep, you've logged in successfully. A consequence of processing that return value from the server is going to be to set this property to indicate that we have logged in successfully. And as soon as that changes, the user interface notices that the value of this function is now true, which means that this expression is going to evaluate to false, which means that this vif is going to tell the button to stop displaying itself. And that's exactly what we saw here. The sign in and the sign up buttons are now gone. About us is still there. Well, why is that? Well, here's the definition of the About Us button. And as you can tell, it doesn't have a vif in it here at all. It's just always going to be displayed no matter what. Before I said that the vif property notices when this is logged in function value changes. And that's actually a core idea in Vue, this notion of reactivity, that we can define a function or a property or a method such that that function or property or method is going to be refreshed when underlying values that it depends on get changed. So back here in the code inside this isLoggedIn function, we saw that it was reliant on the value of a property called isLoggedIn, and we'll talk about where that comes from later. But when the user actually logs into the application, or when the user logs out of the application, the value of that property ends up being changed. And Vue is designed in such a way that when you define a function that includes references to that property, that when the property itself is changed, it's going to inform any other portion of the application that's relying on the value of this function that its value has changed. So that's going to result in the button reacting appropriately to the new value of the isLoggedIn function. If it's false, it will continue to display the button. If it's true, because the user just logged in, it will turn off the display of the button. Take a look at one final component in this navigation bar. That's this vMenu component. Again, that's a part of Vuetify. It knows how to display something that looks like a standardized menu. And if we switch back to the application, we can see here that this is that menu. It drops down. It's got an accounts button that takes us to the list of current accounts. It's got a sign out button that will sign us out of the application. And it's got this top level information that shows an icon and the name of the currently logged in user. Inside of here, we can see that, first of all, there is this section that is going to display a button. This is the icon and the name. That's a button. You can click on it to make it open and close the menu. So that's what's reflected in here in this vButton element. This is a Vuetify button just like the ones up here with a little bit different content. In particular, it's got an icon. This is another Vuetify piece that's using this MDI-account icon. And that's the thing that gives us this little person. Then immediately after that, inside of look, finally, ordinary HTML. Inside of this span tag, we're going to display the user's first name, and then we're going to display another icon that shows the down pointing arrow. That's this portion. What I want to focus on here is the contents of this span tag. First of all, you can see that there's these double curly braces, sometimes called double mustaches, and that's part of the syntax of a Vue template section. So we're inside the template portion of this single file component. Whenever Vue sees double mustaches like this, it looks inside the mustaches and says, what is the value of this expression? So it can contain an arbitrary JavaScript expression, and you can see here that we're going to refer to something called current account and pull out the first name of the user who's currently logged in. We'll come back and talk about how this expression works, but the bottom line is that this is just ordinary JavaScript. Vue is going to evaluate it and replace the value of that expression in place of the double curlies and the expression itself. So that's where the Tom shows up in here, because I logged in as myself. My account has a first name of Tom, and that value is coming out of that variable to fill in the contents of the dropdown. Now when the dropdown shows up, it's displaying what Vuetify refers to as just a list. It's got a couple of buttons, it's got a separator here, and we can see that the next portion after this is a vlist element, again a Vuetify piece, and a vlist consists of list items. So here's a list item that contains the accounts entry, and that's wrapped up in a vlist item title. Vlists can contain quite a lot of rich information in them, including a title and actions and so forth. In this case, we're just using a really simple version of this that's just the title. So we see accounts, and then vdivider is the bar that shows up between accounts and sign out, and then we have sign out itself. That is another list item that has a title of sign out. So those elements together provide the list that's actually dropped down when you toggle the button. One final thing here on this component I'd like to focus on is this list item, which when we click on it, this is the sign out button. When we click on this list item, we want to actually cause something to take place. In particular, we want to execute this function called sign out. If we scroll down here to the code, we can see there's a method here called sign out, and it changes the state of the application. In particular, it's going to tell us that we've logged out of the application. And we'll come back and talk more about this later. But it's the sign out function that's defined inside this component that's responsible for changing the application state under the hood. In order to specify that we want that function to be called in response to some action in the user interface, we use this @click inside of the vlist item in this case. And we can use @click a lot of different places. Any place that you can click a mouse, you could use @click. And the @click, again, is a view thing that says when this item is clicked, invoke this function. So this is the way that we normally get reactivity from our user interface back to code under the hood that's going to do things that make our application work properly. In this particular case, all we're doing is specifying that the user is no longer logged in. We've seen the use of this sign out and is logged in function, but I want to say a little bit more about that. The sign out function, which we saw is what's invoked by clicking on the sign out button from that drop-down list, is what's known in Vue as a method. This is another part of the Vue configuration called methods, and it consists of a object that can have multiple functions defined within it. And all that this methods object is doing is informing Vue of functions that are available to it. So when it's evaluating something like this @click and it sees this expression here, sign out, it's going to use that information to look up to see whether there's a method that has that name. And if there is one, it's going to create the appropriate underlying functionality in the browser to invoke this method when the click event takes place on that item. We can also define in the configuration of this component functions that are part of this computed object. And those are those functions that can be used reactively. Remember that when we were talking about the appearance or disappearance of this button, we said that the isLoggedIn function is going to be used reactively, such that when its value changes, we're going to trigger some behavior in the button object. In order for that to be wired up properly by Vue, we need to put that isLoggedIn function inside this computed object within the configuration. So computed functions are things that will work reactively, whereas methods are simply functions that we can call from various places in our user interface. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about navigation in a single page application. If you think about a traditional web app where you're constantly going back to the server to get new content, every time you type a URL in the address bar or anytime you click on a link on the page, you're going to go to the server, it's going to give you back new content for the URL that you're requesting. There's two aspects of that behavior that are really handy on the web. The first is that because you're always requesting a new URL, the browser can keep track of the history of your navigation of that website, because it'll just store each URL in sequence and allow you to move back and forth between those things. The other thing is that you can actually bookmark pretty much any page in that website by grabbing the complete URL, and then you can go straight to that location in the website in the future. In the early going in Web 2.0 applications, kind of neither of those capabilities was really present. The early versions weren't interacting very nicely with browser history. They didn't really allow you to request a page inside of the application directly by typing in the URL. But that's changed over time, and that's now the behavior that we see if we look at it in our single page app. So for example, in the default page here, I'm just on my sort of home page in this application. If I click About Us, we'll not only navigate to this new view, but we'll see that the About Us element in the URL has been added, and it's also been included in the browser history. So I can just hit the normal browser back button to go back to the previous page, or the forward button to go to the About Us page again. So the same kind of behavior is present in the ability to go back and forth between pages in the history, but it's also the case that I could take this URL, bookmark it, or copy and paste it someplace else, or stick it in an email, and that would allow a user to go straight to that page without having to navigate through the main page of the application itself. So how do we configure this information? Well, it's actually carried in another file here at the top level of our app called router.js. And you can see that we're importing from this package called vue.router, a class called router, and that's software that's actually independent of Vue. You don't have to use this if you don't want to, but it's actually written by the same people that maintain Vue itself, so it integrates with Vue very, very nicely. The way to use that router is then to create a router configuration object. So we're going to invoke new to run the constructor on that router class. And as we've seen all along, we're going to provide an object that configures that router. The important part about this is this list of routes. So the routes list is just the different places inside of our application that we can navigate to without having to go back to the server to fetch a new page. And the one that we've just been exercising is this About Us object. We can see here, for example, that this particular route object says when we go here, let's show the About component. Well, what's that? Let's go take a look at that just briefly. It's one of the entries in my pages directory here, and you can see that it's just a very, very simple object that doesn't have any scripting or any styling. It's just the markup template, and it just displays a header for and a paragraph that say About Us and we're a bunch of nerds. So you can see that that's really all that's going on in here. Back to the route configuration, we also can supply the path that we want to use in the URL when we want to send the user to this particular view within our application. So about-us corresponds to about-us here in the URL. Finally, we can give a name to this route that's independent of the name of the component and of the change to the URL. What this is going to allow us to do is refer to this route by a fixed name inside of our code. It might be that say the marketing department gets a hold of this and they want to have this say more about our company instead of about-us. If we hardwired about-us as the URL all throughout our code and that change got made, now we'd have to go back and change it a bunch of places in our code. Whereas if we use this internal only identifier called about-us, just this name string, we can make a change to the URL that's exposed to the end user in just one place in all of our code and still use this to navigate around. So let me show that. If we go back to our nav bar, remember that we have up here the About Us button that we've just been using. Well, that was defined here. It's a Vuetify button. Now, how do we tell this button that we want to navigate to a particular location? Well, the to property on this button is bound to an expression, and that expression here is ordinary JavaScript inside the quote marks, and we're saying I want to pass an object that says that the name of the route that I want to go to is the one with the name About Us. So this thing tells our button to make the destination URL for navigating here refer to the About Us page in the navigation. And you can see that there's other areas in this nav bar where we're doing this similar thing. So to get to the sign up page, we use the to sign up and to sign in for the sign in and so forth. Let's take a look at the process of signing up for our application here. So I'm going to go to the sign up page, and let me just refresh your memory here. I'm going to go ahead and log out, and then I'm going to sign up again. And what we get when we go to this page is a a form that allows us to fill out the details, a sign up button that's activated, and so forth. So let's take a look at what's going on here. This is the sign up single file component. So we've got two pieces to here. We've got a template area that's going to give us the markup and the different components, and we've got a script area that has all the JavaScript in it. And let's look first at this script area. One of the things that this does is imports another component here that we haven't talked about yet called instructions. So let me navigate to that component. It's here in my components directory, and you can see that its job is to just basically print a paragraph with a certain styling. So it's a paragraph that's got a strong element that says instructions, followed by a colon, and then this details thing. And we can see that the output from that shows up here on our sign up page. There's the bold instructions, and there's this sign up for our nifty site. Those are the details for this instructions component. Now, there's not a lot going on in here, but there is something that's new. In the script section of this component, we've got a props attribute. And what props are is a mechanism for passing values into a Vue component. It's fine for us to have a component like our about page that just stays fixed for all time, but that's not really very interesting. We're often going to want to take a component and reuse it in multiple places and customize it as we're using it. So this instructions component might be an example of that. I'm not doing a whole lot of interesting styling or anything like that, but if we had to provide instructions for our end user in multiple locations in our application, we might want to be able to use this thing to display instructions formatted in a particular way, but we don't want to have to rewrite that markup every time we want to use it. That's the point of a component. We can define it once and reuse it multiple times. In order to provide the specifics for the use of this instructions component, we need a way to pass in those details. And that's, again, the purpose of this props property. You can see that it's defined here as just a list of strings. This is the simplest possible way to define a prop. And the particular one that we've defined here is called details. And that looks suspiciously like the identifier that's inside the double mustaches here in the template. So the idea is that we would like to bind a value for these details, or for this details string, from outside the component, and then when the component is rendered, whatever value we've bound to that is going to be interpolated into this paragraph by the double mustaches mechanism that we talked about before. So where is that taking place? Well, let's go back to our sign up, and here's where we're actually going to make use of it. So we see this new element called instructions, and we're going to give it a prop called details that matches up with the identifier that we saw in the definition of the instructions component. And we're going to give it as a value, a string that is going to be displayed in the output. So we're creating a new instance of this instructions component, specifying the details to be that string. And then when that's rendered by Vue, the prop is going to be bound to that string, and then it's going to be used to show the value inside the double mustaches here. And that's how we end up with sign up for our nifty site in the output. Let's go back to our sign up component. After the instructions that we've just been talking about, we see that the next component here is a vForm. And again, this is a Vuetify form. Most of what a vForm does is provides you with an easy way to do validation inside of your forms. We'll see how that works in a second. The form itself consists of a set of fields. So we've got, in this particular form, we're just asking for text, but any browser input object is available to you from Vuetify. But we're just going to focus on these text fields. One of the things that, as we're entering information into these text fields, that we're going to want to do is to keep track of the values that the user has typed in there. And we're going to do that in our component by defining an object inside of our script tag. So I'm going to scroll down here to the script, and you can see, so here's the script, there's where we imported the instructions, and here's the object that configures this component. We give it a name, we tell it that we're going to use the instructions component inside of it, and then here's a new section that we haven't seen before. It's called data. So data is internal state information for this component. And we're going to store the information about a new member that's signing up inside of an object called new member, and then give it properties that correspond to each of those fields. So to refer to these, we're going to refer to new member.firstname, new member.lastname, and so forth. There's more state in here that we'll come back and talk about in a minute. So let's go back up here to the template, here's this first text field that's going to be used for first name. You can see that the label value here is just a string that says first name, and that's what's showing up here in the form to prompt us to enter the first name. The other important thing here is this property called vModel. This is something that's coming from Vue, and basically what we're telling Vue is that the model information for this text field should come from the newMember.firstName property. And again, that's what we define down here in the script tag, a newMember object that includes a first name property that's initially just blank, but is going to be used to store the value of the first name as the user types it in. Similarly for last name, email, and password. And if we go back up here to the text fields, we can say, or we can see that last name is stored in newMember.lastName, email address is stored in newMember.email, and so forth. The model is the property of the text field that we use to bind the value of the field with an internal representation of that field that we can then use inside of our application. Something else that we'd like to have in our single page application is robust error handling and validation in our forms. In the case of this first name field, we want to make sure that there's actually a value there. So if somebody starts typing in something and then they back it out to make the field empty, Vuetify is going to now give us a message that said, sorry, this field is required. Well, if we look here in the definition of that text field for first name that we've been working on, we'll see that there's a rules property that's bound to rules.required. And rules.required is defined down here in the data section of this component. So here's that rules section. And we've defined several rules, one that's being used for a required field, one for an email address, and one for a password. The simplest of these is required, and the value of each of these properties inside the rules object is a list of functions. What the validation is going to do is call each of the functions in that list, and if that function returns true, it's going to consider that field to be valid, or it's going to consider that that rule has passed. If the function returns a string, it's going to assume that that string is an error message that it wants to display to the end user. In the required case here, we can see we've got first of all, it's a list because we can have more than one function that needs to return true in order to consider the field valid. Here we just have one function, and it's a fat arrow function, as you're not going to be surprised to learn. On the left-hand side, we've got a single parameter called val that's going to be passed the current contents of that text edit field as the user is typing in. And the body of the function is just going to check to see if val.length, that's just the standard JavaScript length property, if val.length is greater than 0. If it is, then it'll return true, and the required error message is not going to show up. But if val.length greater than 0 returns false, then we're going to fall through to the other half of this logical OR operator, and we're going to return a string that just says required. And because a string comes back in that case, the vForm logic recognizes that as an invalid entry, and it's going to furthermore display that same string as the error message. You can see that the rest of these operate similarly. For the email, we want to check to see that it's something that looks like an email address. So we've got the value being passed in this case from the email field. And this is using a regular expression. And it's running the test method on that regular expression to check to see if this regular expression matches the input. If so, it returns true. If not, it falls through to the other part of this logical OR and gives back this error message that would be showing in the form. So if I go in here and type, now you can see already I'm getting invalid email, fred@ziffel.com. Now it's showing up as valid because it now matches that regular expression. The password is a little bit more elaborate in that it demonstrates that we can actually use multiple functions inside these validators. So all three of these take as an argument a list of functions, but required in email only have one function in that list, whereas the password has more criteria. So the first function checks to see if there is at least one uppercase character or one uppercase letter in the string. If not, it says we need an uppercase letter. It also checks to see that there's at least a lowercase letter and at least a digit, and that the length is at least 8 characters long. So all of these functions have to return true, and if any of them doesn't, any of them returns a string, then the validation logic in the form is going to say this is an invalid field, and it's going to display the error messages along with this field. And if we go back up here to look at the form, we can see that our email address field, for example, uses rules.email instead of rules.required. We can reuse these rules, so both the first name and the last name just have rules.required as their rules, because all we're trying to do is check to see that the field is not empty, whereas email has a specific validator and password has a very specific validator as well. One final aspect of this validation is that we can use the current validation status for this whole form to change the behavior of the user interface. You'll notice that right now, because we've got some empty fields and some invalid fields, that the sign up button at the bottom here is grayed out. It's disabled. Let's go in and type the values for some of these other fields in order to, so I've got one more thing I've got to add to this password field, and that's going to cause the field to be validated. And what you want to look at as I type this in is the sign up button there at the bottom. So I put in a 9 to get the digit, and you can see now that the sign up button has enabled itself. The ability for us to click the button is determined by whether or not the form is valid. Let's go see how that works. So here's the code for that button. You can see that it's just an ordinary view button. It's got a label of sign up, and the disabled property, which is just a standard property of all HTML input controls, has been bound to this JavaScript expression. It's going to be disabled if valid is false. Well, as you might expect, that valid variable is defined inside of the data section of our component where all the other state is stored. So here's valid. It's being initialized to false, which makes sense because presumably the first time that this is displayed on the screen, there's not going to be anything in the field, so it's going to be false by default. But now, who's using this? Well, let's go back up here to the form declaration itself. So here's our v form that contains the fields, and you can see that just like the text fields have a model property that specifies where the data that's typed in is going to be stored, the form has a model property that's going to refer to a variable that's going to specify whether or not the form is valid or not. So when the validators are running on all these different fields, if all of the validators are successful, if they all come back with a value of true, the form itself, which is kind of in charge of all these fields, is going to set this variable to true as well. When that gets set to true, because it's inside of the data for this component, it's a reactive variable, which means that when this changes, anything that's dependent on that in the rest of the component is also going to be updated. So the fact that this button has its disabled status dependent on that valid datum, when this changes to be true, that's going to make this expression false, and it's going to say undisable yourself. It always has bothered me that HTML uses disabled instead of enabled, which would have made more sense to me. But at any rate, if disabled is false, then this button is enabled, and that will take place when the form has been completely validated. So now that we've been able to fill out the form, validate the fields, and enable the sign up button, we can go ahead and sign up as a member of this site. But let's figure out what happens when we click this sign up button. So if we go back to the code and scooch down to where the button is declared, we can see that in addition to this disabled property, we've also defined a click handler for this button. The previous example we saw that this was actually spelled @click. That's actually an abbreviation for v_on:click. You can use either one. I think v_on is a little bit more explicit for a new user of Vue. But basically we're just saying when this button's clicked, call this function. Well, that function, we can actually navigate directly to it. It's down here in the JavaScript portion of this component, and it's defined as one of the methods in this component. Remember that methods are just functions that we can invoke from inside of the component itself. And the particular method of interest is this one called handle submit. So I'm about to submit the contents of this form back to the server. The library that we're going to use to do this is called Axios. This is a standard NPM sourced HTTP library that knows how to communicate with HTTP servers like our RESTful API. This .axios is an instance of that Axios object, and we're going to invoke its post method. It's also got a get method and so forth, so we can send different kinds of requests to our backend. And we want to post to the /accounts endpoint. That's defined in the server when we created the happy route handlers and defined this to be /accounts. So there's a post request going to be sent to /accounts. And we're going to pass to that the contents of our form. So we're going to create a JavaScript object with these fields, and we're going to grab the values of first name, last name, email, and password from the data area of our component. Right? We're going to go up and grab these values, new member.firstname and so forth, new member.firstname, and assign them to these properties in this object. And what Axios is going to do is encode this as JSON for transmission as part of this request. It's going to be the payload on the server side, which is going to allow the server to fish those values out of the payload, validate them appropriately, and use them to create a new user. Now you remember that in the route handler on the server side, we're going to do some validation and verification to make sure, for example, that we don't already have a user that has this email address. And what we're going to do was send back a JavaScript object that's going to be encoded as JSON that has a field that says OK and another field that's message if we needed to send some information back to the end user. So when this post completes, this is going to return a promise. So we've got a .then method that's being called on that promise. When this thing is done, we're going to get a result back from Axios. And that result is going to contain a bunch of information about what came back from the server. The results data attribute is going to contain the information that we sent back with the response as that OK and message object. The next thing to do here is to invoke the show dialog method. That's actually down here. And we're going to pass into it a header value of success and then the result message itself. So in the case of a successful completion, this message would have been set by the server to say, created an account for so-and-so. Otherwise, if the OK value is not true, we're going to also call show dialog, but now the header is going to say sorry, and the message will have said something like failed to create an account for whatever. But we're just going to take the message that was sent by the server and use that to populate this dialog box. Let me go back and just demonstrate that. So I'm going to sign up here. We already had an account called Fred Ziffel, or with Fred Ziffel's email address in it. So the server got this request. It said, we've already got somebody with that email address, so I'm going to send back a failure message, a failure object, and that failure object caused this show dialog call to take place, and we displayed this dialog that says sorry, and then the message text that was sent back from the server. Let me go back and change the email address to Fred2, and now it should work, and we get a success message. So we'd made the round trip to the server, it detected that there wasn't already a fred2.ziffel.com, created an account for it, and then formulated this return value that said we've created an account for this email address. So that would have caused this show dialog to be invoked. So what's show dialog? Well, it's another method defined on this component. It's going to take a header, right, success or sorry, and then some text, which is the contents of this message, and it's going to make some changes to the state of this object. It's going to set dialog header, dialog text, and dialog visible. Well, those are defined back up here in the data section of our component, header, text, and visible. The header is going to get set to success or sorry. The text is going to be set to whatever the text was that came back in that JSON object, and then we're going to set the visible property to true. Okay, those, because they're defined inside of the data section of our component, are reactive variables. So let's go see where they're used here. Just at the end of the template section, we can see here we've got this thing called a vDialog. This is another Vuetify object that makes it fairly easy for us to display dialog boxes like we're seeing here in the user interface. The dialog takes a model property, and we've bound that to dialog visible. That's this property initialized to false, And what happens when we set that to true is that the dialog displays itself. So that's why down here in our show dialog function, we're setting dialog visible to be equal to true. We're also going to set the header and text values here, which are going to be used by the dialog component. So when that dialog visible gets set to true, this component is going to be visible on the display. We're using something called a vcard. This is a very flexible display method inside of the Vuetify library for showing all sorts of different formatted information. We're using some subsets of that. There's a title that's showing up here as the success. There's the text itself, which is showing up here as completed or created account. And then there's some actions that in this case we just have one, an OK button. So the card title is using the dialog header from the data. That's this guy down here, just fishing out sorry or success. And it's using the double mustaches again to say, evaluate that expression, which is going to refer to the data object, and interpolate its value in place of the double mustaches. Same thing for the text. We're going to use dialog text, which comes from here, which we set down here as the text that came back from our server. And we're going to use that to display here. And then finally, and then there's a divider here that makes that little bar or that little line. And then the last thing is some actions. And here is the place where we put controls that will do stuff. So you'll notice that we have the OK button. It's actually a button. If we hover over it, you can see it a little bit. We've put in a spacer to force some white space here and push this thing all the way over to the right-hand side. But then this thing is an ordinary Vuetify button. It has a click event that invokes a function called hide dialog, and then the label is OK. Well, what does hide dialog do? Well, we know that the reason that this dialog box showed up in the first place is because we set the dialog visible to true. So you can imagine that maybe hide dialog is going to want to set it to false. And if we scoot down to the definition of hide dialog, what we find is that it says dialog visible equals false. So when we click on the OK button, it makes the dialog go away. We've seen in this sign up component that there's lots of state that's kept in the component itself that help it behave properly. We keep track of the contents of the sign up fields, we keep track of the dialog box information and so forth. In most cases, the state in your application should be as local as possible. So in the case of this sign up form, we only need information about the sign up form in this one spot. There's no point in having access to it from elsewhere or storing it in some other location in our application because it's only really being used here. And that's a really good policy for localization of your state data. There are, however, cases where we want to have state information that's available more broadly. And a great example of that is the information about the currently logged in user. Back when we were looking at the navigation bar, we saw that there was a case where we were able to show the first name of the end user. So when you're logged into the application, let me go back here and sign back in. That when we're signed in, we can see our current username here in this little drop-down. That was coming from this span tag that we looked at before, and you see that there's this thing store, state, current account, first name. Well, what in the world is that? This is actually referring to global state information that's visible across the entire application. And we can see that if we look in this other top-level source file called store.js. This is using something called Vuex. Now, like the Vue router, Vuex is a separate package from Vue, but it's developed by the Vue team, so it integrates really nicely with Vue. And Vuex's purpose in life is to provide convenient state management. Now, because it's global state, this should remind you of the negative impact of using a bunch of global variables in a program. You normally don't want to do that because you can have part of your code relying on a global variable and a totally different part that makes a change to that global variable in unexpected ways, and it makes the application hard to code, hard to debug, hard to test. So generally, using global variables, global state, is a bad idea. but there are definitely places where it's useful to have that. If we think about the management of the currently logged in user, we might want to use that information in a lot of different places in our application, giving permission for that user to do certain operations based on who they are, what their role is, displaying things like the drop-down list in our title bar and so forth. So there are legitimate uses for that, and the alternative to having global state would be to constantly pass that information around from function to function, from component to component, and that would become even more of a nightmare than just having to cope with the global state problem. Vue addresses this problem by saying, here's a standardized way of storing global state information in such a way that it's easy to figure out where global state lives, it's predictable how you change it, and it actually includes some pretty neat debugging tools to help you understand what's going on in the global state. So in Vuex Store, the global state is stored in this property called state. And in our case, we just have a single property inside that object called current account, and it's initialized to null because at the beginning of the execution of the application, nobody's logged into it. But it's from here that nav bar was reading information about the currently logged in user. So if we go back to the nav bar and we see here, $store, state, current account, first name. Well, back here we have state, current account, and then we'll see that when we actually put a value in here, that's going to actually be an object that contains that first name attribute. The remaining question is, where does this $store thing come from? Well, it's a convention in Vue that any variable that starts with a $sign is some kind of a global object that's defined on the Vue instance itself. So if we go back here to the main.js file, we can see that when we initialize this Vue object, which is the kind of the top level component in the whole thing, one of the things that we passed to it was this store. And that store came from the store file that we were just looking at. So we go back over to here, we can see that this store source file, in addition to configuring the store object, makes an invocation of this use method on that Vue object that we just created, and it passes an instance of Vuex to the Vue object itself. What that does is allows the Vuex class to register itself with Vue. And one of the things that's part of that registration process is to define a top-level variable that starts with a $sign, in this case, $store, that can be used anywhere in the application to refer to that global store. So although we still have a global variable here where we're storing all of our state information, there's only one of them, and it's in a predictable location. It's always going to be called $store. So when we're looking at code like our nav bar, we see the $store, we just know right away, okay, that's going to be something that's a global variable, and in order to find out the value of what's there, we're going to look in the state property of the Vuex class and fish out the value of the current account. As I said before, when we make changes to the global state using Vuex, we have a very controlled method for doing that. The only place you're supposed to make changes to that global state is to invoke one of these mutation methods. So inside the configuration of our Vuex store, we've got this mutations property that has a couple of methods defined on it called login and logout. They get passed the state, which is really just a copy of this value for convenience. And then what they do is they can make modifications to that state. So in the case of logging somebody in, we're going to make the account object that's passed into this login mutation be the value of the current account. So we're basically just setting that to point to an object that has first name, last name, and so forth. And then when we want to log a user out, we invoke this function, logout, which basically just sets the current account back to being null. So anytime we want to change the state, we've got to go through one of these functions defined in this mutations property. We can't just willy-nilly go in and make changes to the $state variable, which considerably restricts the sorts of terrible things that can happen when we're using global variables. Now to see how we use these mutations, let's take a look at the invocation of the login mutation. We know that we're going to log in by filling out the sign-in form and pushing the login button. This is quite similar in many ways to the sign up form. It's got a form that lets us type in our username and password. It stores that information in local state. And then when the user clicks the login button, we're going to invoke a function. Well, here's the v on in this login button. When the click event takes place, we're going to invoke a method called login. Well, scooch down here. Here's the login method. You can see, first of all, that we need to verify that the user has supplied the appropriate information for a real account on the system. So we're going to again use Axios to make a request across the web to the RESTful API. We're going to post to the login route. And as the payload of that request, we're going to send our email address and password as shown here. The host is then going to verify that that email address exists and that the password is suitably encrypted matches the one in the database and give back a result. And if the OK property of the JSON object that gets returned from the server is true, we know that the user has successfully authenticated with their account. We're going to check to see if the result.data OK is true, and if it is, we're going to set something in the store to indicate that the user's logged in. So the way that we invoke those login or that login mutation is not by calling it directly. We actually run this other function defined on the store. There's that global store object, a function called commit, and what we pass to commit is the name of the mutation and then any data that's required to be passed to the mutation. So we're going to invoke login, and we're going to send in the details that came back from the server. Remember that the data that the server sends back in the case of a post to the login endpoint is going to contain both the true or false status value as well as the details of that user's account so that we can put it on the client side and do things like display their first name. So we're going to invoke login, we're going to pass in those details. If we go back to the store, we can see that the login is expecting to get those details, and it just takes the details and assigns them to the current account. Another capability of the store is to provide functions that can be invoked from outside the store that have knowledge of what's going on inside the store without broadcasting that information to the rest of the application. An example of that is this isLoggedIn function. It's stored in a property called getters. So these are things that get information out of the store and allow you to encapsulate calculations that don't really have any business being done outside the store but still need to be accessible there. So isLoggedIn is a function that's going to return a Boolean value to say whether there is currently a user logged in or not. And you can see that the way that we're detecting that is by checking to see if this global state variable is null or not. So if it's not null, that means that somebody had invoked the login mutation and set it to be the object that indicates the currently logged in user. In that case, when we call isLoggedIn, we'll get a value of true. On the other hand, if somebody has done the logout mutation, which sets the current account to null, this is going to return false. So the cool thing about encapsulating that behavior inside the store is that if we at some point in the future decide to change the way that we keep track of the currently logged in user, we don't have to make any modifications anywhere else in our code to update the isLoggedIn function. We can just change the implementation in here, and then anybody who's currently calling that function to determine whether there's a user logged in is still going to continue to work just fine because they don't know anything about what's happening under the hood. This is a great example of encapsulation. So let's go back to our nav bar to see the use of that isLoggedIn function. So in the nav bar, we are going to show this menu, right, this guy right here, in the case that there is a currently logged in user. So just like with the showing and hiding of the buttons that we talked about at the beginning of this talk, we can also show or hide the menu by including a vif directive. That's again a view thing, and we're going to show the menu if this isLoggedIn is true. Well, where is that? That's defined down here in a computed property. Remember, these are things that return values to our component based on reactive underlying state. So this isLoggedIn function is going out to the store, running the getter called isLoggedIn, and returning the value from that method. So the effect is anytime that in the store the value of this current account gets changed, that's a reactive variable, which means that it will update the value of this isLoggedIn function, and anybody who is depending on the value of that isLoggedIn function, like our nav bar, is going to have this value changed, and this is also reactive, so the new value is going to percolate up from this isLoggedIn function in the component and update the value of this expression and either enable or disable the menu depending on whether somebody is logging in or logging out.